The coffee shop window exploded in a shower of glass as Sarah Chen dove behind the counter, her heart hammering against her ribs. Outside, 7 figures in dark clothing moved with predatory confidence across the parking lot, their weapons glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights. What they didn't know was that the quiet woman they'd been hunting for 3 months had just made the biggest mistake of their lives by cornering her in a place where she had nowhere left to run. Sarah Chen had been living in Millbrook for exactly 2 years, 4 months, and 16 days when her carefully constructed world began to unravel. She knew the precise count because she'd been marking each day on a small calendar hidden in her kitchen drawer, each X representing another 24 hours of successful anonymity in the small Oregon town that had become her sanctuary. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started like any other in her meticulously routine life. Sarah opened her small accounting practice at precisely 8:30, unlocked the glass door with the modest gold lettering that read, Chen Financial Services, and settled behind her desk with a cup of green tea that had steeped for exactly 4 minutes. Her first client wouldn't arrive until 9, giving her 30 minutes to review the previous day's work and prepare for what she expected to be another unremarkable day in her unremarkable life. Millbrook was the kind of place where nothing significant ever happened. Population 12,000, nestled in a valley between rolling hills covered with Douglas fir and oak trees. It was a town where the biggest excitement came from the annual Harvest Festival and heated debates at city council meetings about parking meters on Main Street. For someone who had spent years in environments where a moment's inattention could mean death, the peaceful predictability of small-town life had been exactly what Sarah needed. Her accounting practice served local businesses, farmers, and retirees who appreciated her attention to detail and her ability to navigate complex tax situations without the big city attitude they associated with larger firms. Sarah had discovered she genuinely enjoyed helping people organize their finances, finding satisfaction in bringing order to chaos and helping clients understand their financial positions. It was work that required precision and careful analysis, skills that translated well from her previous life, though her clients had no idea about the connection. Sarah had chosen accounting deliberately. It was respectable, necessary, and completely unremarkable. Accountants didn't draw attention to themselves, didn't appear in newspaper articles, and certainly didn't appear in the kind of intelligence reports that had made her previous identity impossible to maintain. She'd spent 6 months studying for her CPA certification while living in a studio apartment in Seattle, using the name Sarah Chen for the first time and carefully constructing a background that would withstand casual scrutiny. The name itself had been chosen with care. Sarah was common enough to blend in anywhere, while Chen suggested Asian heritage that matched her appearance without being specific enough to narrow down her origins. She'd created a story about growing up in California, attending state universities, and working for mid-sized accounting firms before deciding to start her own practice in a smaller community. It was believable, boring, and completely fabricated. Her apartment above the practice was spartanly furnished but comfortable. A small kitchen where she prepared simple meals, a living room with a reading chair positioned to observe the street below, and a bedroom that contained the only evidence of her true identity. Hidden behind a false panel in the closet was a rifle case containing a custom-built precision weapon and a small collection of items that belonged to her former life. Sarah looked at these items perhaps once a month, reminding herself of who she'd been while reinforcing her commitment to who she was trying to become. The rifle was a masterpiece of precision engineering, built around a chassis designed for extreme accuracy at distances that most people couldn't even see clearly. The barrel was hand-lapped steel, the trigger mechanism adjusted to break at exactly 2 pounds of pressure. And the scope was military-grade optics capable of clear target acquisition at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. Sarah had fired perhaps 50 rounds through the weapon since arriving in Millbrook, conducting careful maintenance and testing at a remote area outside town where she could practice without attracting attention. Those practice sessions were her only connection to her former skills. Once a month, usually on a Sunday morning when the area was deserted, Sarah would drive to abandoned quarry 15 miles from town and set up targets at various distances. She told herself it was simply maintaining equipment, but the truth was more complex. The precision shooting required by her former profession had been deeply satisfying in ways that her current life couldn't completely replace. The mathematical precision, the complete focus required, the moment when breath, heartbeat, and trigger squeeze aligned perfectly to send a bullet exactly where she intended it to go. But Sarah had been determined to leave that life behind completely. The skills that had made her valuable to certain government agencies had also made her a target for their enemies. 3 years earlier, she'd been Rebecca Martinez, a civilian contractor who specialized in long-range precision shooting for situations that required plausible deniability. The work had been dangerous but purposeful, eliminating threats that conventional military operations couldn't touch without creating political complications. Rebecca Martinez had died in a car explosion in Phoenix, Arizona, according to official records. The explosion had been real, but Rebecca had been 3 blocks away when it happened, watching from a coffee shop as the vehicle she was supposed to be driving disintegrated in a ball of flame. Someone had discovered her identity, her location, and her daily routine. The bomb had been intended to eliminate a problem, but instead it had simply forced Rebecca to disappear completely and begin the process of becoming Sarah Chen. The transition had been difficult in ways she hadn't anticipated. Learning to sleep without checking weapon positions and escape routes. Training herself to make casual conversation without constantly analyzing people for potential threats. Adjusting to a life where the most dangerous situation she faced was helping elderly clients navigate Medicare paperwork. But gradually, Sarah had adapted to civilian life, finding unexpected satisfaction in the simple rhythms of small-town existence. Her clients had become more than professional relationships. Mrs. Patterson, who owned the flower shop, always brought Sarah a small arrangement during tax season. Mike Williams, who ran the local hardware store, had taught her about gardening and home maintenance. Janet Rodriguez, who managed the credit union, had become something approaching a friend, someone Sarah could have lunch with and discuss books, local politics, and the small dramas that constituted excitement in Millbrook. These relationships had taught Sarah something important about the cost of her former life. As Rebecca Martinez, she'd been effective, professional, and completely isolated. Every relationship had been tactical, every conversation measured for operational security. She'd been successful at eliminating threats, but she'd never experienced the simple pleasure of helping Mrs. Patterson understand her Social Security benefits or celebrating when Mike's hardware store had its best year in a decade. Sarah had begun to believe that she'd successfully escaped her past. Rebecca Martinez was officially dead, her skills and experience buried with that identity. Sarah Chen was building something real, something permanent, something that belonged to her rather than to the shadowy agencies that had employed her former skills. She'd even begun to think about expanding her practice, perhaps taking on additional clients or specializing in small business consulting. The first indication that her carefully constructed new life was in danger came on a Tuesday morning in October, when a man she didn't recognize walked past her office 3 times within an hour. Sarah noticed him because part of her training that she'd never been able to completely suppress involved automatic threat assessment. The man's behavior was wrong for the environment. He moved with the controlled awareness of someone conducting surveillance, pausing at specific points to observe her office while pretending to check his phone or tie his shoes. Sarah watched him through her office window, noting details automatically. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Mid-30s, average height and build, dark hair, clothing that was slightly too expensive for Millbrook, but not expensive enough to suggest wealth. Most significantly, he moved with the fluid efficiency of someone who'd received professional training in surveillance techniques. He wasn't a private investigator hired by a suspicious spouse or an insurance company checking on a claim. He was something more dangerous. After the third pass, the man disappeared, but Sarah's sense of unease remained. She found herself checking the street more frequently, varying her routine slightly, paying attention to cars that appeared repeatedly in her vicinity. For 2 weeks, nothing unusual happened, and Sarah began to hope that the surveillance had been coincidental or unrelated to her true identity. Then she spotted the second watcher. This one was more subtle, a woman in her 20s who appeared to be a college student visiting local businesses for some kind of research project. She spent time in the coffee shop across from Sarah's office, the bookstore next door, and the restaurant where Sarah often had lunch. Individually, these visits could have been innocent, but together they provided perfect coverage of Sarah's daily movements. Sarah realized with growing alarm that she was being watched by professionals. Multiple people, coordinated surveillance, careful attention to operational security. Someone had discovered that Sarah Chen was not who she claimed to be, and they were gathering intelligence for some kind of action. The question was whether they knew her true identity or were simply investigating suspicious inconsistencies in her background. Sarah began implementing counter-surveillance techniques, measures she'd hoped never to use again. She varied her routes to work, changed her schedule randomly, and started carrying a small mirror that allowed her to observe people behind her without obvious head movements. She identified at least 3 additional watchers over the next month, confirming that she was the target of a significant intelligence-gathering operation. The surveillance team was good, but not perfect. Sarah's experience in similar operations allowed her to detect patterns and mistakes that less trained observers would have missed. More concerning was what the surveillance suggested about whoever was directing it. The resources required for this level of coverage, the professionalism of the operatives, and the patience to conduct extended observation all pointed to an organization with significant capabilities and serious intentions. Sarah considered her options carefully. She could run, abandoning Sarah Chen, just as she'd abandoned Rebecca Martinez. But the idea of starting over again was exhausting. She'd invested 2 years in building relationships and establishing her life in Millbrook. More importantly, running would only delay the inevitable. Whoever had found her once could find her again, and the next time she might not have warning. Alternatively, she could contact her former handlers, the government agencies that had employed Rebecca Martinez, and request protection or assistance. But that would mean acknowledging that Sarah Chen was a fiction and potentially returning to the world she'd worked so hard to escape. It would also require trusting people who had already failed to protect her identity once. The third option was the most dangerous, but potentially the most permanent. Sarah could identify whoever was hunting her and eliminate the threat directly. It would require using skills she'd hoped never to employ again, taking actions that would destroy any possibility of maintaining her civilian life, but it might be the only way to achieve real security. Sarah spent sleepless nights weighing these alternatives, studying the surveillance patterns and trying to determine the intentions of whoever was watching her. Were they planning to expose her identity, eliminate her, or recruit her for new operations? The answer would determine her response, but she was running out of time to gather more information. The decision was made for her on a cold November morning when Sarah discovered that someone had been inside her apartment. Nothing was obviously missing or disturbed, but Sarah's training had taught her to notice subtle indicators of intrusion. A book moved slightly from its position on the nightstand. Dust patterns on her desk that had been altered by careful searching. Most significantly, the hidden panel in her closet showed microscopic scratches around the edges that suggested someone had discovered and opened it. Sarah checked the rifle case with mounting dread. The weapon was still there, apparently untouched, but the implications were terrifying. Whoever was watching her had gained access to her most carefully guarded secret. They knew that Sarah Chen was armed with military-grade precision weapons, which meant they almost certainly knew she was not a simple small-town accountant. That evening, Sarah began preparing for war. She moved through her apartment methodically, gathering items that would be essential for survival, and destroying anything that could provide additional intelligence to her enemies. Financial records went into the fireplace, along with photographs and personal documents that belonged to Sarah Chen's fictional history. She assembled a go-bag containing cash, false identification, and emergency supplies, hiding it in her car where it could be retrieved quickly if rapid departure became necessary. Most importantly, Sarah prepared her weapon. She disassembled the rifle completely, cleaning and inspecting every component before reassembling it with the precision of someone whose life might depend on its performance. She loaded magazines with hand-selected ammunition, each cartridge chosen for consistency and accuracy. She tested the scope 0 using a laser bore sight, confirming that the weapon would hit exactly where she aimed it. Sarah also began varying her routine more dramatically, never following the same pattern twice, never appearing in the same location at predictable times. She started carrying a concealed pistol, keeping it within easy reach whether she was in her office, her apartment, or her car. She established multiple escape routes from every location she frequented, mentally rehearsing responses to different types of attacks. The stress of constant vigilance was exhausting, but Sarah forced herself to maintain the appearance of normal life. She continued meeting with clients, handling their financial needs, and participating in the small-town activities that had become part of Sarah Chen's identity. But beneath the surface, she was preparing for a confrontation that would determine whether she lived or died. The confrontation came sooner than she expected. Sarah was closing her office on a Friday evening in late November when she noticed unusual activity in the parking lot across the street. 3 vehicles that hadn't been there earlier were positioned to control the exits from the downtown area. Men in dark clothing were moving between the vehicles, communicating through earpieces and obviously coordinating some kind of operation. Sarah realized that the surveillance phase was ending. Whatever her watchers had been planning, they were preparing to execute it tonight. She had perhaps minutes before they moved against her, and she needed to decide quickly whether to run or fight. Sarah looked around her office one last time, thinking about the life she'd built as Sarah Chen, the relationship she'd formed, and the peaceful existence she was about to lose forever. Then she walked to her car, retrieved her go-bag, and began implementing the contingency plans she'd hoped never to use. The rifle case was in her apartment, hidden behind the false panel that her enemies had already discovered. Getting to it would require crossing 2 blocks of downtown Millbrook while potentially under observation by hostile forces. But without the precision weapon, Sarah would be severely disadvantaged in any prolonged confrontation. Sarah moved through the alley behind her office building, using shadows and parked cars for concealment while she observed the deployment of whoever was hunting her. She counted at least 7 individuals, all moving with military-style coordination and carrying weapons that suggested they were prepared for significant resistance. These weren't local criminals or private investigators. They were professionals, possibly military contractors or intelligence operatives. As Sarah watched from concealment, she realized that her enemies had made their first tactical mistake. They were treating her like a target who would try to escape rather than someone who might choose to fight. Their deployment was designed to contain and capture not to defend against a precision attack from an unexpected direction. Sarah smiled grimly as she began moving toward her apartment. Her enemies were about to discover that they'd seriously underestimated the woman they'd been hunting. Sarah Chen might be a peaceful small-town accountant, but Rebecca Martinez had been one of the most effective long-range specialists in the business. The war for her survival was about to begin, and Sarah intended to make sure she was the only one who walked away from it. Sarah reached her apartment building through a circuitous route that took her behind the post office, through the park, and along the creek that ran behind the downtown businesses. The route added 15 minutes to her journey, but it allowed her to approach her building from an angle that her watchers probably hadn't anticipated. She paused in the shadow of the oak tree that grew beside her building, studying the windows and roofline for any indication that the structure was already under surveillance. The building appeared clear, but Sarah knew that professional surveillance teams often used techniques that were invisible to casual observation. She would have to assume that her movements were being tracked and that she had very little time before her location was compromised. Sarah used her key to enter through the building's rear entrance, moving quickly but quietly up the stairs to her second-floor apartment. Every step felt dangerous now. Every shadow could conceal a hostile observer. Every sound might indicate that her enemies were already inside the building. The hallway outside her apartment was empty, but Sarah noticed that the light bulb that normally illuminated the far end had been removed or broken. Professional surveillance teams often created areas of darkness where they could position observers without being detected. Sarah approached her door carefully, listening for any sounds from inside her apartment while checking for obvious signs of forced entry. The door was locked, just as she'd left it, but Sarah knew that meant nothing. Professional operatives could defeat standard residential locks without leaving obvious traces. She turned the key slowly, listening for any sounds from inside, then pushed the door open while remaining in the hallway where she had options for movement and cover. Her apartment was dark and appeared empty, but Sarah's training screamed warnings about the tactical situation. If enemies were inside, they would be positioned to control the entrance and eliminate anyone who entered. If they weren't inside yet, they could arrive at any moment, trapping her in a location with limited escape routes. Sarah needed her rifle, but retrieving it would require entering the apartment and accessing the hidden panel in her bedroom closet. Every moment she spent inside increased her risk of being trapped, but without the precision weapon, she would be fighting at a severe disadvantage against multiple professional opponents. Sarah drew her concealed pistol and moved into the apartment, using techniques she'd learned for clearing potentially hostile spaces. She checked corners, closets, and areas where attackers might be waiting, moving with the fluid efficiency of someone who'd survived similar situations before. The apartment appeared empty, but Sarah knew that appearances could be deceiving. She reached her bedroom closet and quickly accessed the hidden panel, retrieving the rifle case and additional ammunition. As she assembled the weapon, Sarah realized that she could hear vehicles moving in the street outside her building. Multiple engines, coordinated movement, the sound of a tactical team positioning for assault. Sarah moved to her bedroom window and carefully observed the street below. 7 vehicles now surrounded her building, and men in tactical gear were deploying to control all possible exits. She could see the professional coordination, the communication equipment, and the weapons that confirmed these were not local law enforcement officers conducting a routine investigation. Sarah realized that her enemies had made their second tactical mistake. By surrounding the building, they'd assumed she would try to escape rather than engage. They were positioned to capture someone fleeing, not to defend against precision fire from an elevated position. More importantly, they'd positioned themselves in a parking lot with minimal cover, creating perfect conditions for a long-range engagement. Sarah opened her rifle case and began final preparations for combat. She assembled the weapon with practiced efficiency, loaded it with carefully selected ammunition, and adjusted the scope for the range and environmental conditions. Through the bedroom window, she had clear sight lines to the hostile forces below, with enough elevation to engage targets over the vehicles they were using for concealment. But Sarah also understood that once she fired the first shot, there would be no going back. Sarah Chen, small-town accountant, would disappear forever. The life she'd built, the relationships she'd formed, and the peaceful existence she'd worked so hard to create would all be destroyed in the space of a few seconds. Yet as Sarah studied the tactical situation below, she realized she had no real choice. Her enemies had found her, surrounded her, and were preparing to either capture or eliminate her. Running was no longer an option, and surrender would almost certainly mean death. The only way to survive was to use the skills that had made Rebecca Martinez valuable to government agencies and dangerous to their enemies. Sarah settled into a shooting position behind her bedroom window, adjusting the rifle for stability and optimal sight lines. Through her scope, she could see individual faces among the tactical team below. They were professionals, probably former military or intelligence operatives, but they were also overconfident. They'd spent weeks conducting surveillance on a seemingly harmless accountant, and they'd underestimated the threat she represented. Sarah began selecting targets, identifying the team leader based on his position and the way others oriented toward him for direction. She noted the locations of communication equipment, heavy weapons, and individuals whose elimination would create maximum disruption in the tactical team's coordination. She calculated ranges, wind effects, and the sequence of shots that would provide the best chance of survival. As Sarah prepared to engage, she found herself thinking about the clients she'd served, the friends she'd made, and the simple life she was about to lose forever. Mrs. Patterson would wonder why her accountant had suddenly disappeared. Mike Williams would probably assume she'd decided to move back to the city. Janet Rodriguez might worry that something had happened to her friend. But none of them would ever know the truth about who Sarah Chen really was or why she'd had to disappear. They would remember a quiet, helpful woman who'd been good with numbers and seemed slightly mysterious. It was a better legacy than Rebecca Martinez had been able to leave behind. Sarah controlled her breathing and began her final target acquisition. Through the scope, she could see the tactical team leader speaking into his radio, probably coordinating the final assault on her building. In a few minutes, they would breach her apartment, expecting to find a frightened civilian who could be easily captured or eliminated. Instead, they were about to discover that they'd made the fatal error of underestimating their target. Sarah Chen was about to remind them that some skills never completely disappear, and some people are far more dangerous than they appear. Sarah's finger rested lightly on the trigger as she watched the team leader below raise his hand, preparing to signal the final assault. Through her scope, she could see his face clearly, noting the confident expression of someone who believed he was about to complete a routine operation. The tactical team had positioned themselves with textbook precision for containing a fleeing suspect, but their formation was fatally flawed for defending against elevated fire. The first shot shattered the evening silence like thunder. Sarah's bullet took the team leader center mass, dropping him instantly beside the black SUV he'd been using for cover. The remaining 6 operatives scattered with professional speed, diving behind vehicles and scanning for the source of the shot. But their hasty movements revealed another critical error in their planning. They'd assumed any resistance would come from ground level, positioning their vehicles to block escape routes rather than to provide protection from overhead fire. Sarah's second shot caught the communications specialist as he attempted to reach the radio equipment in the lead vehicle. The man spun backward against the car door, his earpiece flying into the darkness as he collapsed onto the asphalt. Without their communication coordinator, the remaining team members would have difficulty coordinating their response or calling for reinforcements. The third shot eliminated the heavy weapons specialist who'd been moving toward a case containing what appeared to be military-grade assault rifles. Sarah's bullet found him as he crouched beside the rear vehicle, his body jerking violently before going still. 3 shots, 3 targets down, and the tactical team's carefully planned operation was disintegrating into chaos. The surviving operatives finally located Sarah's position. Muzzle flashes from the bedroom window giving away her location. Automatic weapons fire erupted from the parking lot, bullets shattering the glass and chewing chunks from the window frame. Sarah rolled away from the window, using the building's structure for protection while she repositioned for her next engagement. But the return fire had served its purpose. The remaining team members now knew where she was, and they were adapting their tactics accordingly. Sarah could hear shouted commands from the street below as they coordinated an assault on her building. Professional operatives didn't panic when plans went wrong. They improvised, adapted, and pressed their attack using whatever advantages they retained. Sarah moved to her living room window, which provided a different angle on the parking lot and the tactical team's positions. Through her scope, she could see that the survivors had taken better cover and were preparing to breach her building. 2 men were moving toward the front entrance, while a third provided covering fire from behind an armored vehicle that hadn't been visible during her initial assessment. The 4th shot took the covering fire specialist as he exposed himself to provide support for his advancing teammates. Sarah's bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him behind the vehicle where he wouldn't be an immediate threat. She deliberately aimed for a non-fatal hit, hoping to wound rather than kill someone who was simply doing his job. But the shot had the desired tactical effect of eliminating his ability to provide effective fire support. The 2 operatives advancing on her building paused when their covering fire ceased, uncertain whether to continue their assault without backup. Sarah used their hesitation to relocate again, moving to her kitchen window where she had a clear view of the building's front entrance. If they continued their advance, she would be positioned to engage them as they attempted to breach her apartment. But Sarah also realized that her tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. She'd eliminated or disabled 4 of the 7 original attackers, but the survivors were adapting to her capabilities and changing their approach. More concerning, she could hear sirens in the distance, indicating that local law enforcement was responding to reports of gunfire. Within minutes, her private war would become a public incident involving innocent police officers who had no understanding of the situation they were entering. Sarah needed to end the confrontation quickly, before additional complications arrived. She gathered extra ammunition and prepared to move to a new position that would allow her to engage the remaining threats while avoiding civilian casualties. But as she prepared to leave her apartment, Sarah heard the distinctive sound of boots on the building's rear staircase. The tactical team had split their remaining forces, sending some operatives to assault the front entrance while others approached. From behind, Sarah was about to be caught between 2 groups of armed professionals in the confined space of her apartment building. The tactical situation had shifted from advantageous to desperate in the space of minutes. Sarah grabbed her rifle and moved toward her apartment door, positioning herself where she could observe both the hallway and the front entrance. She could hear careful footsteps on the stairs, multiple individuals moving with practiced stealth toward her floor. They would reach her position within minutes, and she would have to engage multiple targets in close quarters where her precision rifle would be less effective than their automatic weapons. The apartment door exploded inward as the front assault team breached using shaped charges. Sarah had been expecting conventional lockpicking or battering ram techniques, not military-grade explosives. The blast threw her backward, temporarily, stunning her and filling the apartment with smoke and debris. Her ears rang from the concussion, and she struggled to maintain her grip on the rifle as she tried to regain her bearings. Dark figures moved through the smoke, advancing into her. apartment with weapons raised. Sarah could see the distinctive outline of automatic rifles and tactical gear, confirming that these were not local criminals but professional military contractors. They moved with the fluid coordination of a special operations team, clearing angles and covering each other's advance with practiced efficiency. Sarah forced herself to focus despite the disorientation from the blast. She was outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped in a confined space where her marksmanship advantages were minimized. But she also had intimate knowledge of the apartment's layout and the advantage of defending familiar territory. More importantly, her attackers were advancing into a space where she'd prepared contingencies for exactly this scenario. The first operative through the door moved toward her living room, scanning for targets with his weapon raised. Sarah engaged him from her position near the kitchen, her shot taking him in the chest and dropping him onto her coffee table. The impact sent books and magazines flying, but more importantly, it created an obstacle that would impede the advance of his teammates. The second operative tried to flank Sarah's position by moving along the wall toward her bedroom. But Sarah had anticipated this tactic, positioning a mirror that allowed her to observe the hallway while remaining in partial cover. Her shot caught him as he attempted to cross the open doorway, the bullet striking his weapon and spinning him backward into the wall. But Sarah's muzzle flashes had revealed her position to the remaining attackers. Automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple directions, forcing her to take cover behind her kitchen island while bullets shredded the cabinets and appliances around her. The concentrated fire was designed to pin her down while additional operatives maneuvered for flanking shots. Sarah realized that her defensive position was becoming untenable. The kitchen island provided temporary cover, but it wouldn't stop sustained automatic weapons fire. She needed to move, but any movement would expose her to multiple shooters, who were already coordinating their fire to cover different angles and escape routes. Then Sarah heard new voices from the stairwell, and her heart sank as she realized what was happening. The rear assault team had reached her floor and was preparing to enter the apartment from behind. She would be caught in crossfire between two groups of professional operatives, trapped in an apartment that was being systematically destroyed by automatic weapons. But as the voices grew closer, Sarah realized something that changed her tactical assessment completely. The new arrivals weren't speaking in the same language as the original assault team. She could hear Spanish mixed with English, street slang rather than military terminology, and the distinctive cadence of gang communication, rather than professional operational coordination. The tactical team that had surrounded her building had been joined by local criminal elements, but Sarah couldn't determine whether they were working together or if multiple groups were converging on her location for different reasons. The distinction mattered because it would affect her targeting priorities and survival strategies. Sarah used the momentary lull in direct fire to assess her ammunition situation. She'd fired 6 shots from her precision rifle and had perhaps 20 rounds remaining in loaded magazines. Against multiple opponents in close quarters, she would need to make every shot count while conserving ammunition for the most critical targets. The gang members entered her apartment through the rear door, moving with less tactical sophistication than the military contractors, but compensating with aggressive determination. Sarah could see the difference immediately in their movement patterns, weapon handling, and communication. These were street fighters rather than professional soldiers, dangerous in different ways, but potentially easier to outmaneuver in a confined space. Sarah's next shot targeted the gang member who appeared to be directing the others, a heavily tattooed man carrying a modified assault rifle and shouting orders in rapid Spanish. Her bullet took him in the upper chest, dropping him immediately, and creating confusion among his followers who suddenly found themselves without clear leadership. But eliminating the gang leader also triggered an unexpected response. The surviving military contractors ceased their advance and began withdrawing toward the front entrance, apparently recognizing that the tactical situation had become too complex to control effectively. They were cutting their losses and extracting, rather than risk being caught in a three-way firefight with unknown variables. Sarah realized that her enemies had made their most critical tactical error. By involving local gang members in their operation, the professional military team had introduced chaos into what should have been a controlled assault. The gang members weren't following military protocols or coordinating with the contractors. They were operating independently, creating confusion that Sarah could exploit. Sarah moved toward her bedroom, using the chaos to reposition while the remaining gang members argued among themselves about their next move. She could hear sirens getting closer, indicating that police response was imminent. Within minutes, her apartment would be surrounded by law enforcement officers who would complicate any resolution of the situation. From her bedroom window, Sarah could see that the military contractors were indeed withdrawing, loading their casualties into vehicles and preparing to leave the area before police arrived. They'd accomplished their primary objective of confirming her identity and capabilities, even though they'd failed to capture or eliminate her. Sarah suspected this had been as much an intelligence-gathering operation as an assassination attempt. But the gang members showed no signs of withdrawing. If anything, they seemed more determined to continue the fight now that their primary competition had been eliminated. Sarah could hear them moving through her apartment, searching for her position and preparing for a final assault on her bedroom where they believed she was trapped. Sarah counted at least 4 distinct voices, suggesting that several gang members remained active despite the casualties they'd taken. They were armed with automatic weapons and had the advantage of numbers, but they lacked the tactical training that would make them truly dangerous in a coordinated assault. More importantly, they were operating in an environment they didn't know against an opponent whose capabilities they'd seriously underestimated. Sarah prepared for the final phase of the confrontation, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether she survived to escape Millbrook or died in the apartment where she'd tried to build a peaceful life. The gang members were about to discover that their fatal error hadn't been in underestimating a small-town accountant, but in failing to understand that some people are far more dangerous than they appear. The gang members split into 2 groups, approaching her bedroom from both the hallway and the living room. Sarah could hear their whispered communications as they coordinated their final assault, but their street tactics were no match for the military precision she'd learned during her years as Rebecca Martinez. They were about to attempt a simultaneous breach from multiple directions, but their timing was imprecise and their movements predictable. Sarah positioned herself in the bedroom closet, using the doorframe for cover while maintaining sight lines to both approach routes. The first gang member appeared in the bedroom doorway, scanning the room with his weapon raised. Sarah's shot took him cleanly, dropping him in the doorway where his body would impede the advance of his teammates. The second group tried to enter through the living room, but they were forced to climb over the casualties from the earlier engagement. Sarah engaged them as they navigated the obstacles, her precision fire disrupting their advance and forcing them to take cover behind furniture. That provided minimal protection against military-grade ammunition. But Sarah's tactical situation remained precarious. She was running low on ammunition, trapped in a confined space, and facing multiple opponents who were becoming more coordinated as they adapted to her defensive tactics. More critically, she could hear police vehicles arriving outside, their sirens indicating that the confrontation was about to involve innocent law enforcement officers. Sarah made a tactical decision that would determine the outcome of the entire engagement. Rather than continuing to defend from her bedroom, she would take the offensive, using her superior marksmanship and tactical training to eliminate the remaining threats before police entered the building. It was a high-risk strategy, but it offered the best chance of ending the confrontation before additional casualties occurred. Sarah gathered her remaining ammunition and prepared to leave the relative safety of her bedroom. The surviving gang members had taken cover in her living room, believing they had her trapped and could wait for reinforcements or police intervention. They were about to discover that their prey had become the hunter, and that their final tactical error would be their last mistake. The apartment fell silent except for the distant sound of sirens and the whispered communications of the remaining gang members. Sarah controlled her breathing and prepared for the decisive engagement that would determine whether she lived to fight another day or died in the ruins of the peaceful life she'd tried so hard to build. The war for her survival was entering its final phase, and Sarah intended to be the only one who walked away from it. Through the bedroom doorway, Sarah could see movement in her living room as the remaining gang members repositioned themselves for what they believed would be their final assault. They had no idea that their target was no longer the frightened civilian they'd expected to find, but a trained killer who'd decided that negotiation time was over. Sarah Chen, small-town accountant, had served her purpose. Now it was time for Rebecca Martinez to finish what these men had started, and to remind them why some people choose to disappear rather than fight, and what happens when they're forced to abandon that choice. The silence stretched for another moment, then Sarah moved into action, emerging from the bedroom with the fluid precision of someone who'd survived far worse odds in far more dangerous places. The gang members were about to learn the difference between street violence and professional lethality, and the lesson would be their last. Sarah stepped into her living room with the controlled grace of a predator that had decided the hunt was over. The remaining gang members had positioned themselves behind her overturned couch and kitchen table, weapons trained on the bedroom doorway where they expected her to appear. Their amateur tactics had left them exposed to flanking fire from the angle Sarah had chosen, and their whispered arguments revealed positions that her trained ear could pinpoint with deadly accuracy. The first gang member died before he realized she'd moved. Sarah's shot caught him as he leaned around the couch to scan the bedroom, the bullet passing through his skull and embedding itself in the wall behind him. His automatic rifle clattered to the floor as his body slumped forward, creating the kind of sudden silence that follows violent death. The second shooter spun toward Sarah's position, his weapon tracking across the room with desperate speed. But desperation made him careless, exposing his position completely as he abandoned cover to acquire his target. Sarah's bullet took him in the chest, the impact lifting him backward over the kitchen table, where he crashed into her refrigerator and slid to the floor. 2 shots, 2 kills, and the apartment fell into an eerie quiet, broken only by the approaching sirens and the labored breathing of whoever remained alive among her attackers. Sarah moved carefully through the debris of her former home, scanning for additional threats while assessing the tactical situation that would determine her next decisions. She found the last gang member hiding behind her washing machine, clutching a pistol with shaking hands while blood seeped from a wound in his shoulder. He couldn't have been more than 19 years old, his face marked with tattoos that proclaimed allegiance to organizations Sarah didn't recognize. When he saw her approaching with the rifle, his eyes widened with the desperate fear of someone who'd finally understood the magnitude of his mistake. "Please," he whispered in accented English, his weapon trembling as he tried to decide whether to surrender or make a final desperate attempt at violence. "I got kids, man. This wasn't supposed to happen like this." Sarah studied the young man's face, seeing the mixture of bravado and terror that characterized so many people who'd gotten involved in situations beyond their understanding. He was probably a low-level criminal who'd been promised easy money for what should have been a simple intimidation job. Instead, he'd stumbled into a war zone where professional killers had turned a routine operation into a massacre. "Drop the gun," Sarah said quietly, her rifle trained on his center mass. "Drop it now and you might live long enough for the paramedics to treat that shoulder." The gang member hesitated for a moment, weighing his chances of survival against whatever loyalty he felt to his dead companions. Then the sound of police radios from the street below decided the matter for him. He placed the pistol on the floor and raised his hands, wincing as the movement aggravated his wounded shoulder. Sarah kicked the pistol away and moved toward her bedroom window to assess the situation outside. Police vehicles had surrounded the building, their red and blue lights painting the darkness in alternating colors that reminded Sarah of war zones she'd tried to forget. Officers were establishing a perimeter and preparing for tactical entry, following procedures designed for domestic disturbances rather than military-style combat operations. Through her scope, Sarah could see that the professional contractors had vanished completely, leaving behind only empty vehicles and carefully staged evidence that would confuse any investigation. They'd accomplished their primary mission of confirming her identity and capabilities while avoiding capture or identification by local authorities. The gang members had been left behind to face whatever consequences followed, expendable assets, whose fate was irrelevant to the larger operation. Sarah realized that she had perhaps minutes before police entered the building and discovered a scene that would be impossible to explain through conventional criminal justice procedures. 7 bodies, military-grade weapons, and evidence of precision marksmanship that far exceeded anything local law enforcement would expect from a small-town accountant. The investigation would raise questions that would expose her true identity and destroy any possibility of maintaining her civilian cover. But Sarah also understood something more fundamental about her situation. The professional contractors had withdrawn not because they'd failed, but because they'd succeeded in their actual objective. They'd forced her to reveal her true capabilities, to demonstrate the skills that proved she was Rebecca Martinez rather than Sarah Chen. The gang members had been sacrificial pawns, designed to create a situation where she would have to fight or die. Sarah gathered essential items from her go-bag while considering her limited options. She could surrender to police and attempt to explain the situation, but that would require revealing her true identity and accepting whatever legal consequences followed. She could attempt to escape before police entered the building, but that would mean abandoning any pretense of innocence and becoming a fugitive from law enforcement. The third option was the most dangerous but potentially the most effective. Sarah could stage the scene to support a different narrative, one that would allow her to maintain her civilian identity while explaining the violence that had occurred. It would require careful manipulation of evidence and precise timing, but it might allow Sarah Chen to survive the destruction of her apartment. Sarah moved quickly through the apartment, arranging the scene to support the story she intended to tell. She placed weapons near the gang members' bodies in positions that suggested they'd been fighting among themselves when police arrived. She concealed her precision rifle and most of her ammunition, keeping only a small pistol that could reasonably belong to a civilian defending her home. The wounded gang member watched her preparations with growing understanding. "You're going to say we shot each other," he said quietly. "That we came here to rob you and turned on each other when things went wrong." Sarah looked at him carefully, recognizing that his cooperation would be essential for maintaining her cover story. "That's exactly what happened," she said firmly. "You broke into my apartment to rob me. Your friends got greedy and started shooting each other over the take. You're the only survivor, and you're going to tell the police exactly that story." The young man nodded slowly, understanding that his survival depended on accepting the narrative she was constructing. "What about the military guys? The ones with the fancy equipment who started all this?" Sarah studied his face, noting the intelligence beneath the street facade. He'd observed more of the tactical situation than she'd expected, and his question suggested he understood the complexity of what had really occurred. That made him both an asset and a liability in terms of maintaining her cover story. "There were no military guys," Sarah said carefully. "Just you and your friends robbing the wrong apartment and paying the price for it. Anyone who says different is going to have a very difficult time explaining what they were doing here." The gang member considered this for a moment, then nodded again. He was smart enough to realize that the professional contractors had abandoned him to face whatever consequences followed, and that cooperating with Sarah offered his best chance of survival. More importantly, he probably understood that challenging her version of events would result in his immediate death. Police voices echoed from the building's stairwell, indicating that tactical units were beginning their advance toward her floor. Sarah made final adjustments to the scene, ensuring that the physical evidence would support her story while concealing anything that might reveal her true capabilities. She placed herself in a defensive position that suggested she'd been hiding from the gang members rather than hunting them. The apartment door, already destroyed by the contractor's explosive breach, provided easy access for police units. Sarah could hear them coordinating their advance, calling out warnings and preparing for the kind of violent confrontation that the gunfire had suggested. They would be expecting armed resistance and multiple casualties, but they wouldn't be prepared for the carefully staged scene they were about to discover. "Police, show yourselves with your hands visible." Sarah stepped into view of the doorway, her hands raised and her small pistol visible but unthreatening. "I'm the tenant," she called out. "I'm unarmed now. There's one wounded suspect in the kitchen, but I think the others are dead." Tactical officers flooded into the apartment, weapons raised and scanning for additional threats. Sarah submitted to being handcuffed and searched, maintaining the demeanor of a traumatized civilian rather than a trained operative. The officer's initial assessment confirmed what Sarah had hoped. They saw a frightened accountant who'd defended herself against violent criminals, not a professional killer who'd eliminated a tactical team. Detective Maria Santos arrived 20 minutes later, a 20-year veteran of the Oregon State Police, whose experience with violent crime had given her the ability to read people and situations with remarkable accuracy. She studied the scene carefully, noting the positions of the bodies, the types of weapons involved, and the patterns of damage that told the story of what had occurred. "Miss Chen," Detective Santos said, settling into a chair across from Sarah. In what remained of her living room, "I need you to walk me through exactly what happened here tonight." Sarah had rehearsed her story during the police response, crafting a narrative that would explain the violence while concealing her true capabilities. "I was closing my accounting office when I noticed some men watching the building," she began. "I've been nervous lately because there have been break-ins in the neighborhood, so I came home and called 911. Detective Santos consulted her notes. "We don't have any record of a 911 call from this address tonight." Sarah had anticipated this question. "I started to call, but then I heard them breaking into the building. I was afraid they'd hear me talking to the dispatcher, so I hung up and tried to hide." The detective nodded, making additional notes while studying Sarah's demeanor for signs of deception. "Then what happened?" Sarah continued her carefully constructed narrative, describing how the gang members had broken into her apartment, demanded money and valuables, then turned on each other when they discovered she had little worth stealing. She explained her defensive actions as the desperate attempts of a civilian to survive a violent home invasion, emphasizing her fear and confusion rather than her tactical precision. "The one in the kitchen says his friend started shooting each other over drug money," Detective Santos observed. "His story matches yours about them fighting among themselves." Sarah felt a measure of relief that the wounded gang member was maintaining the agreed narrative. His cooperation was essential for her cover story, and his criminal background would make him a credible witness to the kind of violence that gangs inflicted on each other. But Detective Santos continued studying the scene with the careful attention of someone who'd investigated hundreds of violent crimes. "What I'm having trouble understanding," she said slowly, "is how you managed to survive a firefight that killed 6 people. That's either remarkable luck or remarkable skill." Sarah had prepared for this challenge as well. "I grew up on a ranch in eastern Oregon," she said. "My father taught me to shoot when I was 12, and I've been hunting since I was old enough to hold a rifle. When people started shooting in my apartment, I knew I had to defend myself. The detective made more notes, but Sarah could see skepticism in her expression. A ranch background would explain basic firearms familiarity, but it wouldn't account for the precision marksmanship that had eliminated multiple armed opponents in close-quarters combat. Sarah needed to provide additional context that would satisfy the detective's concerns without revealing her true training. "I also compete in shooting sports," Sarah added. "Precision rifle competitions, mostly. It's a hobby I picked up to stay connected to my childhood, but I never thought I'd need those skills to save my life." Detective Santos looked up with renewed interest. "What kind of competitions? Local, regional, or national level?" Sarah realized she was walking into dangerous territory. Too much detail about her competitive shooting would invite investigation that might reveal inconsistencies in her background. Too little detail would seem suspicious to a detective who was already questioning her story. "Regional mostly," Sarah sighed carefully. "Some national events when I can afford the travel. It's expensive, but it helps me relax and reminds me of growing up on the ranch." The detective spent another hour documenting the scene and taking statements from Sarah and the wounded gang member. The physical evidence supported their shared narrative of a home invasion that had escalated into violence among the perpetrators. The gang member's criminal history provided context for the weapons and tactics involved, while Sarah's explanation of her survival relied on skills that were plausible for a civilian with extensive firearms experience. But Sarah could see that Detective Santos remained unsatisfied with certain aspects of the case. The precision of the fatal shots, the tactical sophistication of the scene, and the complete absence of the professional contractors who'd initiated the operation all raised questions that couldn't be answered through conventional criminal investigation. "Miss Chen," the detective said finally, "I want you to understand that this investigation is going to continue for some time. We'll need additional statements, ballistics analysis, and background verification before we can close the case. I strongly recommend that you cooperate fully with our investigation and avoid any activities that might complicate our understanding of what occurred here." Sarah nodded, recognizing the warning implicit in the detective's words. Law enforcement suspected that the official story didn't capture the full truth of what had happened, but they lacked evidence to prove alternative explanations. As long as Sarah maintained her cover identity and avoided activities that would reveal her true capabilities, she might be able to survive the investigation. The wounded gang member was transported to the hospital under police guard, where he would face charges for breaking and entering, weapons violations, and conspiracy. His cooperation with the investigation would likely result in a plea bargain. That would keep him in prison for several years, removing him as a potential threat to Sarah's cover story. Sarah was released pending further investigation, but she understood that her life in Millbrook was effectively over. Her apartment was a crime scene that would be sealed for weeks while investigators processed evidence. Her accounting practice would be disrupted by police interviews and media attention. Most importantly, her carefully constructed identity had been exposed to scrutiny that might reveal inconsistencies she couldn't explain. Over the following days, Sarah began implementing contingency plans she'd hoped never to use. She closed her accounting practice, citing the trauma of the home invasion and her need for extended recovery time. She arranged for temporary housing, while ostensibly waiting for her apartment to be released by police investigators. She began the careful process of extracting herself from the relationships and obligations that had defined Sarah Chen's life. The hardest part was saying goodbye to people who'd become genuine friends. Mrs. Patterson brought flowers and offered to help with insurance claims, never suspecting that the quiet accountant she'd grown fond of was preparing to disappear forever. Mike Williams offered the use of his guest room and assistance with reconstruction, unaware that Sarah would never return to rebuild what had been destroyed. Janet Rodriguez was the most difficult goodbye because their friendship had been the closest thing to a normal relationship that Sarah had experienced since abandoning her former identity. Janet sensed that something fundamental had changed, that her friend was preparing for a departure that had nothing to do with repairing damaged property. "You're leaving, aren't you?" Janet said during what would be their final lunch together. "Not just temporarily while they fix your apartment, but leaving permanently." Sarah had prepared explanations for this conversation, stories about family obligations and job opportunities that would justify her departure from Millbrook. But, facing Janet's direct question, she found herself struggling to maintain the deception that had protected them both. "The attack changed everything," Sarah said finally. "I can't feel safe here anymore, knowing that people were willing to break into my home and threaten my life. I need to start over somewhere else, somewhere with better security and fewer memories." Janet nodded slowly, but Sarah could see that her friend recognized the inadequacy of this explanation. "If you ever need anything," Janet said quietly, "if you ever find yourself in trouble or need someone to talk to, you have my number. I don't care where you are or what name you're using. I'll help if I can." The offer revealed how much Janet had suspected about the complexities of Sarah's situation. Perhaps she'd never believed the complete cover story, or perhaps the events of that night had revealed inconsistencies that couldn't be explained through conventional means. Either way, her willingness to offer unconditional support represented the kind of loyalty that Sarah had never expected to find in civilian life. Sarah completed her departure from Millbrook 2 weeks after the confrontation, leaving behind a carefully maintained fiction about relocating to Seattle for employment opportunities. She'd paid her outstanding obligations, transferred her clients to other accounting practices, and settled the insurance claims related to the apartment damage. Sarah Chen's exit from the community was orderly, unremarkable, and completely final. But as Sarah drove out of Millbrook for the last time, she carried with her something she'd never possessed as Rebecca Martinez. She'd experienced genuine friendship, professional satisfaction, and the simple pleasure of belonging to a community that valued her contributions. The relationships she'd formed had taught her about aspects of human nature that couldn't be learned through military training or intelligence operations. More importantly, Sarah had proven to herself that she could choose when and how to use the lethal skills that had defined her former identity. The confrontation in her apartment had demonstrated that Rebecca Martinez's capabilities remained intact, but they would be employed according to Sarah's decisions rather than government directives. She'd become something new, neither the government asset she'd once been nor the complete civilian she'd tried to become. Sarah drove toward an uncertain future, carrying false identification that would allow her to establish a new identity in a new location. But this time, she wouldn't be running from her past or trying to bury skills that couldn't be forgotten. Instead, she would integrate both aspects of her identity, using her capabilities in service of principles she'd chosen rather than obligations imposed by others. The professional contractors who'd forced this confrontation had succeeded in proving that Sarah Chen was indeed Rebecca Martinez, but they'd failed to understand what that revelation would create. They'd expected to expose a government asset who could be recruited or eliminated according to institutional priorities. Instead, they'd liberated someone who would operate according to her own moral compass, using skills that had once served government agencies in pursuit of objectives she would define herself. 3 months later, in a small coastal town in Northern California, a woman named Lisa Rodriguez opened a financial consulting practice specializing in helping small businesses navigate complex regulatory requirements. Her clients appreciated her attention to detail, her ability to solve problems that had stumped other consultants, and her willingness to work with companies that larger firms considered too small or unprofitable to serve. Lisa Rodriguez had no visible connection to either Sarah Chen or Rebecca Martinez, but she carried forward the lessons learned from both identities. She understood the value of normal human relationships and the satisfaction of using her skills to help people build better lives. But she also retained the capabilities that had made her valuable to government agencies. and she remained alert for situations where those skills might be needed to protect the innocent or eliminate threats that conventional authorities couldn't address. The gang members who'd made the fatal error of underestimating a small-town accountant had learned too late that some people are far more dangerous than they appear. But their mistake had also taught Sarah something equally important, that strength didn't have to mean isolation, and that the most effective way to disappear was to become someone worth finding. The confrontation that had destroyed Sarah Chen's peaceful life had ultimately created something more valuable, a person who could choose her own battles while maintaining the connections that made those battles meaningful. Lisa Rodriguez would build new relationships, serve new clients, and create new memories, but she would never again allow herself to become completely defenseless against those who would exploit apparent weakness. The single shot that had ended the confrontation in Millbrook had been the beginning of something new, a life that balanced deadly capability with human compassion, professional precision with personal connection. It was a combination that had never existed in either of her previous identities, but it was exactly what the world needed from someone with her unique capabilities. In her new office overlooking the Pacific Ocean, Lisa Rodriguez filed the last of her business registration documents and prepared to begin another carefully constructed life. But this time, she would be ready for whatever challenges emerged, confident in her ability to protect what mattered while eliminating threats that endangered the peaceful existence she'd worked so hard to build. The war for her survival was over, but the mission to live authentically while remaining prepared for whatever came next was just beginning. 6 months after establishing her practice in Mendocino, Lisa Rodriguez received a phone call that would test every lesson she'd learned about balancing her dual nature. The voice on the other end belonged to Detective Maria Santos, the Oregon investigator who'd handled the Millbrook case with persistent skepticism. "Miss Chen, or should I say Miss Rodriguez," Detective Santos began without preamble. "We need to talk about what really happened in that apartment." Lisa felt her blood chill as she recognized the measured tone of someone who'd spent months gathering evidence. She'd known this moment might come, but she'd hoped her careful departure from Oregon had closed that chapter permanently. The fact that Santos had tracked her to California suggested the investigation had uncovered more than the official reports indicated. "I'm sorry, Detective, but I think you have the wrong person," Lisa replied, maintaining the calm professionalism that had served her well in her new identity. "My name is Lisa Rodriguez, and I run a consulting practice here in Mendocino. I've never been to Oregon." Detective Santos chuckled softly, but there was no humor in the sound. "That's an interesting story, Miss Rodriguez. It's almost as creative as the one you told me about surviving the gang shooting through childhood hunting experience. Would you like to know what ballistics analysis revealed about those fatal shots?" Lisa realized that her carefully constructed narrative was unraveling, but she also understood that Santos was fishing for information rather than presenting definitive proof. If the detective had concrete evidence linking Lisa Rodriguez to Sarah Chen, she would have coordinated with California authorities rather than making a phone call that could be easily denied. "Detective, I genuinely don't know what you're talking about," Lisa continued. "Perhaps you should verify that you're calling the correct person before making accusations that could constitute harassment." The line went quiet for several seconds before Santos responded. 7 shots fired, 7 fatal hits, all at ranges that would challenge trained military snipers. The gang member who survived has developed an interesting case of amnesia about certain details, but he's been very consistent about one thing. He says the woman who killed his friends moved and shot like someone who'd done it before. Lisa understood that Santos was building a circumstantial case based on inconsistencies in the official story and evidence that suggested professional rather than civilian capabilities. But without direct proof connecting Lisa Rodriguez to Sarah Chen, the detective was limited to indirect pressure and psychological manipulation. "Detective Santos, Lisa said firmly, "unless you have legal authority to interrogate me about crimes committed in California, I'm going to end this conversation. If you believe I've violated any laws, please coordinate with appropriate local authorities through proper channels." Before Santos could respond, Lisa disconnected the call. But she understood that the conversation represented more than casual follow-up investigation. Someone with significant resources had connected her new identity to her former life, and Detective Santos was being used to apply pressure for purposes that went beyond closing a simple gang violence case. Lisa activated security protocols she'd hoped never to implement, beginning with electronic surveillance of her communications and systematic observation of her daily environment for signs of hostile surveillance. She also began preparing contingency plans for rapid departure from Mendocino if the situation escalated beyond law enforcement pressure to active operational threats. The first indication that her situation was more serious than detective follow-up came 2 days later when Lisa noticed unfamiliar vehicles conducting surveillance of her office building. The watchers were more sophisticated than the gang members who'd threatened her in Oregon, but less professional than the military contractors who'd orchestrated that confrontation. These appeared to be private investigators or corporate security personnel, suggesting that commercial rather than government interests were now involved. Lisa realized that her carefully managed disappearance from Millbrook had attracted attention from multiple directions. Law enforcement wanted to close investigative gaps in the gang shooting case. The professional contractors who'd escaped that night probably wanted to complete their original mission. Now it appeared that additional parties had developed interest in her capabilities, possibly for recruitment or elimination purposes. The situation became critical when Lisa identified one of the surveillance operatives as someone she recognized from her previous life as Rebecca Martinez. Thomas Chen, no relation despite the shared surname, had been a civilian contractor who specialized in tracking down former government assets who'd attempted to disappear. His presence in Mendocino meant that someone with access to classified personnel records had hired him to locate and assess her current status. Lisa knew Thomas's reputation and methods well enough to understand that her operational security had been completely compromised. He would have her true identity, her complete background, and detailed analysis of her capabilities. More concerning, he worked exclusively for clients who intended to use rather than simply locate their targets. Someone wanted to recruit Rebecca Martinez for operations that required her specific skills. That evening, Lisa received a second phone call, this one from a number she didn't recognize, but a voice that carried the distinctive accent and cadence of someone with extensive military experience. "Miss Rodriguez," the caller said without introduction, "my name is Colonel James Patterson. I represent certain interests that would like to discuss employment opportunities that match your unique qualifications." Lisa understood immediately that this was the recruitment attempt she'd been expecting since leaving government service. Colonel Patterson's approach was more direct than the elaborate deception that had drawn her into the Somalia mission, but the underlying purpose was identical. Someone needed a precision shooter for operations that required plausible deniability. "Colonel, I'm a financial consultant," Lisa replied. "I don't have any qualifications that would interest military organizations." Patterson's laugh suggested he found her denial amusing rather than convincing. "Miss Rodriguez, we both know that your accounting skills, while impressive, are not the capabilities that brought you to our attention. We have a situation developing in South America that requires someone with your very specific background and talents." Lisa felt the familiar tension that came with being drawn back toward the world she'd tried to leave behind. But this time, she had something she'd lacked during her previous recruitment, the knowledge that she could choose her own terms rather than accepting whatever conditions were offered. "What kind of situation?" Lisa asked, recognizing that gathering information was more valuable than maintaining denials that weren't being believed anyway. Colonel Patterson's tone became more serious as he outlined the operational scenario. American businessman named David Williams has been kidnapped by a criminal organization operating along the Colombian border. The kidnappers are demanding $50 million in ransom, but they've also threatened to execute Williams if any rescue attempt is detected. Lisa understood the tactical challenge immediately. A conventional military rescue would be detected long before it could reach the hostage location, but a single precision shooter might be able to eliminate the guards and create an opportunity for extraction. It was exactly the kind of mission that had made Rebecca Martinez valuable to government agencies. "Why not use active military assets?" Lisa asked. "Special operations units have personnel with similar capabilities." Patterson's response revealed the political complications that made civilian contractors necessary. The Colombian government has specifically prohibited American military operations in the region where Williams is being held. Any official rescue attempt would create diplomatic incidents that could destabilize relationships throughout South America. Lisa realized that she was being offered an opportunity to use her skills for a genuinely humanitarian purpose while maintaining the independence she'd worked to achieve. David Williams was an innocent victim whose life depended on capabilities that very few people possessed. But accepting the mission would also mean acknowledging her true identity and returning to the world of classified operations. "What are the terms?" Lisa asked, understanding that her question represented tacit acceptance of the mission's legitimacy. Colonel Patterson outlined compensation that far exceeded anything Lisa could earn through legitimate consulting work, along with operational support that would ensure her safety and success. But more importantly, he offered something that government employment had never provided: complete autonomy over mission planning and execution. You would have full authority over target selection, tactical approach, and extraction procedures, Patterson explained. Our role would be limited to intelligence support and logistical assistance. The operation would be entirely under your control. Lisa spent the next hour discussing operational details, analyzing the intelligence package, and assessing the risks involved in accepting the mission. The target location was accessible. The hostage was being held in conditions that favored precision shooting, and the criminal organization lacked the sophistication to detect or counter sniper operations. But Lisa also understood that accepting this mission would establish a precedent for future recruitment. Once she demonstrated willingness to take independent contracts, she would become a permanent target for organizations that needed her capabilities. The peaceful life she'd tried to build would be perpetually interrupted by offers to use skills that couldn't be unlearned. "I need 48 hours to consider your proposal," Lisa said finally. "And I need guarantees that accepting this mission won't result in permanent entanglement with your organization or others like it." Colonel Patterson agreed to the timeline, but couldn't provide the assurances Lisa wanted about future independence. "Miss Rodriguez, people with your capabilities will always be in demand. The question is whether you'll choose clients and missions that serve purposes you believe in, or whether you'll remain passive while others suffer because the help they need isn't available." After ending the call, Lisa spent the night walking along the Mendocino coastline, thinking about the path that had brought her from a shooting competition in Montana to a clifftop in California, where she was deciding whether to become an active participant in the shadow world of civilian contractors. The peaceful sound of waves against the rocks provided a stark contrast to the violence that had defined much of her adult life. Lisa realized that her attempt to escape her past had been fundamentally flawed because it was based on denial rather than integration. She'd tried to suppress capabilities that were part of her identity, to pretend that Rebecca Martinez had never existed. But the confrontation in Oregon had proven that those skills would always be part of her, whether she chose to acknowledge them or not. The next morning, Lisa called Colonel Patterson and accepted the mission, but with conditions that would allow her to maintain control over her future involvement in similar operations. She would establish her own consulting firm that specialized in high-risk extractions and threat elimination, working with clients who met her ethical standards rather than accepting assignments from government agencies with broader agendas. "You're going into business for yourself," Patterson observed when Lisa outlined her terms. "That's an unusual approach for someone with your background." Lisa understood that most former government assets either remained in official service or disappeared completely into civilian life. Creating an independent operation that could work with multiple clients while maintaining ethical autonomy was unprecedented, but it offered the best chance of balancing her skills with her values. "Colonel, I've learned that I can't escape what I am, but I can choose how to use it," Lisa explained. "This mission will be a test case for whether that approach can work in practice." 3 days later, Lisa was boarding a commercial flight to Bogota, carrying false identification and equipment that had been carefully disguised as photography gear. Her rifle was broken down into components that appeared to be camera supports and surveying instruments, while her ammunition was concealed in containers labeled as camera batteries and film canisters. The flight gave Lisa time to study the intelligence package Colonel Patterson had provided, analyzing satellite imagery of the compound where David Williams was being held and assessing the tactical challenges involved in eliminating his captors without endangering the hostage. The mission would require infiltration across difficult terrain, establishment of a shooting position at extreme range, and precise timing to coordinate her shots with an extraction team. But as Lisa reviewed the operational details, she also found herself thinking about the larger implications of her decision. By accepting this mission, she was acknowledging that her attempts to live as a normal civilian had been an illusion. The skills that made her valuable would always create obligations to use them when innocent lives were at stake. Lisa arrived in Colombia 12 hours later, where she was met by a local contact who provided transportation and final intelligence updates. David Williams was being held at a remote compound in the mountains east of Medellin, guarded by members of a criminal organization that specialized in kidnapping wealthy foreigners for ransom. The guards were experienced but not professionally trained, creating opportunities for someone with Lisa's capabilities. The compound was located on a hillside that provided excellent defensive positions against ground assault, but offered multiple vantage points for long-range engagement. Lisa would need to infiltrate within 800 meters of the target building, eliminate the guards in rapid succession, and maintain overwatch while an extraction team secured the hostage. Lisa spent 2 days conducting reconnaissance of the target area, using hiking and birdwatching as cover for detailed observation of guard routines and defensive preparations. The criminal organization followed predictable patterns that suggested they'd been successful in previous operations and had grown overconfident about their security procedures. But Lisa also discovered complications that hadn't been included in the original intelligence briefing. The compound housed not only David Williams but also 2 other hostages, a German engineer and a Canadian journalist who'd been captured in separate incidents. Any rescue operation would need to account for multiple captives in different locations within the compound. Lisa contacted Colonel Patterson to report the additional hostages and recommend modifying the mission to include their rescue. The expanded operation would be more complex and dangerous, but abandoning innocent people to save operational simplicity was not acceptable to Lisa's ethical standards. "Miss Rodriguez," Patterson said during their encrypted communication, "our contract specifies rescue of David Williams only. The additional hostages are outside the scope of our agreement and our authority." Lisa understood the bureaucratic logic, but she also recognized that this was precisely the kind of situation where independent contractors could act when official organizations were constrained by limited mandates. She had the capability to save 3 lives instead of 1, and the moral obligation to do so regardless of contractual technicalities. "Colonel, I'm modifying the mission parameters," Lisa announced. "All 3 hostages will be extracted, or none will be. That's not negotiable. Patterson's silence suggested he was consulting with superiors about Lisa's demand, but she was prepared to abort the mission rather than compromise her ethical standards. The independence she'd insisted on maintaining was meaningless if she couldn't use it to make decisions that reflected her values rather than bureaucratic convenience. "Very well, Miss Rodriguez," Patterson said finally. "The mission is authorized for extraction of all hostages. But understand that this sets a precedent for how you operate that may affect future opportunities." Lisa smiled as she understood that. Patterson's warning was actually an acknowledgement of her success in establishing independent authority. Future clients would know that working with her meant accepting her moral standards rather than imposing their own limitations. The next morning, Lisa began her final approach to the compound, carrying her precision rifle and enough ammunition to eliminate every guard in the facility if necessary. She'd identified 7 targets who would need to be neutralized before the extraction team could safely approach the hostage buildings. But as Lisa settled into her shooting position overlooking the compound, she realized that this mission represented more than just another rescue operation. It was the first step in a new career that would allow her to use her deadly skills in service of principles she'd chosen rather than orders she'd been given. The woman who'd started as Rebecca Martinez tried to disappear as Sarah Chen and emerged as Lisa Rodriguez was about to become something entirely new, an independent operator who could balance lethal capability with moral purpose. The 7 targets below had no idea that their greatest mistake wasn't kidnapping wealthy foreigners for ransom, but assuming that no one would come for their victims with the skills necessary to make them pay the ultimate price for their crimes. Lisa's crosshairs settled on the first guard as dawn broke over the Colombian mountains. 800 meters below, the compound remained quiet except for the routine movements of sentries who had no idea their world was about to change forever. Through her scope, she could see David Williams sitting in a wooden chair outside the main building, his hands bound but his posture suggesting he remained unbroken despite weeks of captivity. The shot broke the morning silence like thunder rolling across the valley. The guard manning the north watchtower crumpled without a sound, his rifle clattering against the wooden platform as he fell. Lisa was already acquiring her second target. Before the echo faded, her precision rifle cycling smoothly as she shifted to engage the roving patrol near the hostage building. Her second bullet caught the patrol guard mid-stride, dropping him beside the generator that powered the compound's communications equipment. The facility's radio capability died with him, cutting off any possibility of calling for reinforcements or coordinating a response to the attack that was systematically dismantling their security. Lisa's third shot eliminated the heavy weapons specialist positioned behind sandbags overlooking the valley approach. The man had been scanning the tree line with binoculars, searching for threats that might emerge from the jungle below, never considering that death would come from the mountain above. His body pitched forward over the machine gun he'd been preparing to use against ground assault. The compound erupted into confused activity as the surviving guards realized they were under attack from an unknown position. Men ran between buildings, shouting commands in Spanish while trying to locate the source of the precision fire that was picking them off with mechanical efficiency. But their tactical training was limited to intimidation and close-quarters violence, not defending against military-grade sniper operations. Lisa's fourth shot took the guard who'd been moving toward the building where the Canadian journalist was being held. The man's intention had been to use the hostage as a human shield, but Lisa's bullet found him before he could reach the doorway. His death sent a clear message to the remaining guards that threatening the captives would only accelerate their own elimination. The fifth guard tried to establish defensive fire from behind a concrete barrier, but his position was exposed to Lisa's elevated angle of attack. Her bullet struck him as he attempted to return fire toward her suspected location, his weapon discharging harmlessly into the air as he collapsed backward against the wall he'd been using for protection. 2 guards remained, and both had taken cover inside buildings where Lisa couldn't engage them directly. But their defensive positions also trapped them, preventing them from reaching the hostages or coordinating any meaningful resistance. Extraction team could now advance without fear of organized opposition. Lisa keyed her radio to signal the assault team. Overwatch to ground team. 7 targets neutralized. 2 remaining hostiles have taken cover in buildings Alpha and Charlie. All hostages appear secure and unharmed. The response came immediately. Ground team acknowledges. Beginning final approach. Maintain overwatch and engage any targets of opportunity. Through her scope, Lisa watched the extraction team emerge from the jungle below, moving with the fluid precision of special operations professionals. They advanced up the hillside using tactical formations designed to minimize exposure while maximizing firepower, but the precision shooting had eliminated most of the defensive positions that could have threatened their approach. The team reached the compound perimeter without encountering resistance. The remaining guards had apparently decided that discretion was the better part of valor, abandoning their positions rather than facing certain death from an enemy they couldn't see or counter. Lisa maintained her overwatch position, but didn't need to engage additional targets as the extraction proceeded. David Williams was freed first, the businessman requiring medical attention for dehydration and minor injuries, but otherwise in good condition considering his ordeal. The German engineer was discovered in a separate building, bound but unharmed and grateful beyond words for rescue he'd never expected to come. The Canadian journalist was the most defiant of the 3, having apparently spent her captivity gathering intelligence about her captors rather than simply enduring imprisonment. Ground team to Overwatch, came the radio call. All packages secured and ready for extraction. Compound is clear of hostile activity. Lisa maintained her position until the extraction team and hostages had departed the immediate area, ensuring that no pursuit developed from hidden positions or reinforcements that might have been positioned outside her observation range. Only when she received confirmation that the rescued hostages were safely aboard extraction helicopters did she begin her own withdrawal from the mountain position. The mission had been completed with surgical precision, 7 guards eliminated, without a single casualty among the rescue team or hostages. But more importantly for Lisa, the operation had proven that her independent contractor model could work effectively. She'd maintained complete operational control while delivering results that exceeded the client's expectations. Lisa's extraction route took her through mountain terrain that had been carefully scouted during her reconnaissance phase. She moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd survived similar operations in equally dangerous environments. But this time she carried with her the satisfaction of having chosen her own mission rather than following orders dictated by others. The debrief with Colonel Patterson took place in a secure location in Bogota, where Lisa provided detailed operational reports and received final compensation for the successful mission. But the conversation also established parameters for future cooperation between her independent consulting firm and the organizations that required her specialized services. "Miss Rodriguez," Patterson said as they concluded their business, "I've received authorization to offer you a retainer arrangement. Guaranteed compensation in exchange for priority access to your services when situations arise that require your particular capabilities." Lisa had anticipated this proposal and prepared her response accordingly. "Colonel, I appreciate the offer, but I won't accept exclusive arrangements that limit my ability to choose clients and missions. However, I'm willing to discuss preferred partner status that provides you with early notification of my availability." Patterson smiled, recognizing that Lisa had successfully established herself as an independent operator who could negotiate from a position of strength, rather than accepting whatever terms were offered. "I think we can work with those parameters. There are situations developing in other regions that could benefit from your approach to problem solving." Lisa understood that her success in Colombia had opened doors to opportunities throughout the world where precision shooting could resolve complex problems that conventional military or law enforcement couldn't address. But she also knew that each mission would need to meet her ethical standards, rather than simply offering attractive compensation. 3 months later, Lisa received a call from an unexpected source. Detective Maria Santos contacted her again. But this time the conversation had a completely different tone than their previous adversarial exchange. "Miss Rodriguez," Santos began, "I'm calling to inform you that the Millbrook case has been officially closed. The investigation concluded that the gang members died in violence among themselves during a robbery that went wrong." Lisa understood that Santos was providing more than just case closure notification. The detective was acknowledging that she'd accepted the official narrative despite her suspicions about what had really occurred in that Oregon apartment. "Detective Santos," Lisa replied, "I appreciate you letting me know, but as I mentioned before, I was never involved in any incident." "In Oregon?" Santos chuckled, but this time the sound carried genuine warmth rather than skepticism. "Of course not, Miss Rodriguez. But if you were hypothetically connected to that case, you might be interested to know that the surviving gang member has become quite cooperative with law enforcement. He's provided information that led to the arrest of several people involved in organized crime activities." Lisa realized that her decision to spare the wounded gang member had created positive consequences beyond her original calculations. His cooperation with authorities was dismantling criminal networks that had been operating with impunity, protecting future victims from the kind of violence that had destroyed her peaceful life in Millbrook. "That's good to hear, Detective," Lisa said. "I hope the information leads to justice for other victims of violent crime." Santos paused before continuing. "Miss Rodriguez, there's something else you should know. We've received inquiries from federal agencies about whether we have any interest in reopening the investigation. I've informed them that local law enforcement considers the matter resolved and has no plans for further investigation." Lisa understood that Santos was providing a warning disguised as information. Federal agencies were apparently still interested in her activities, but local law enforcement was protecting her privacy by refusing to cooperate with broader investigations. It was an unexpected form of protection from someone who'd once been a potential threat. "Detective, I appreciate your thoroughness in keeping me informed about developments that might affect law-abiding citizens in your jurisdiction," Lisa said. Carefully, Santos laughed again. "Miss Rodriguez, I've been a police officer for 23 years. I've learned to recognize when justice has been served, even if it doesn't always happen through conventional channels. Sometimes the good guys win, and sometimes it's better not to ask too many questions about how that happened." After ending the call, Lisa realized that her journey from Rebecca Martinez through Sarah Chen to Lisa Rodriguez had taught her something fundamental about the nature of justice and moral responsibility. The skills that had made her valuable to government agencies could also serve broader purposes when applied according to ethical principles rather than institutional priorities. Lisa's consulting firm grew steadily over the following year, handling missions that ranged from hostage rescue to threat elimination in situations where conventional authorities lacked jurisdiction or capabilities. Each operation was evaluated according to strict ethical criteria that ensured her skills were used to protect innocent people rather than advance political agendas or commercial interests. But the most satisfying aspect of her new career wasn't the successful missions or professional recognition. It was the knowledge that she'd found a way to integrate all aspects of her identity without compromising her values or abandoning her humanity. She was no longer running from her past or denying her capabilities, but using them purposefully in service of principles she'd chosen. The phone call that would define her future came on a quiet Tuesday evening as Lisa was reviewing proposals for new missions. The voice belonged to Janet Rodriguez, her former friend from Millbrook, but the conversation would establish a connection that went far beyond casual friendship. "Lisa, Janet said without preamble. "I know who you really are, and I know what you really do. I also know that you help people who can't get help anywhere else. My daughter has been kidnapped, and I need someone with your specific capabilities." Lisa felt her world shift as she realized that her past had caught up with her future in ways she'd never anticipated. Janet's daughter had been taken by human traffickers operating along the Mexican border, and conventional law enforcement was constrained by jurisdictional limitations and diplomatic complications that prevented effective action. "Janet," Lisa said quietly, "how did you find me?" Janet's response revealed the depth of her desperation and the extent of her research. "I've spent 6 months tracking down rumors about an independent operator who specializes in impossible rescues." Every lead pointed back to a consulting firm in California run by someone whose background couldn't be verified through normal channels. Lisa understood that Janet had connected her new identity to her former life through careful investigation rather than accidental discovery. But more importantly, she recognized that this mission would test every principle she'd established about choosing clients and operations based on ethical rather than personal considerations. "Tell me about your daughter," Lisa said, knowing that her response would determine whether she could maintain professional objectivity or whether personal loyalty would compromise her judgment. Janet's description of her daughter's kidnapping and the trafficker's demands revealed a situation that perfectly matched Lisa's operational criteria: innocent victim, inadequate official response, and criminals who deserved elimination rather than arrest. But it also involved someone Lisa cared about personally, creating emotional complications that could affect her tactical decision-making. "Janet, I'll take the case," Lisa said finally. "But you need to understand that I'll be operating as a professional contractor, not as a friend trying to help. That means following my protocols and accepting my decisions about how to handle the situation." Janet's relief was evident in her voice as she agreed to Lisa's terms. But Lisa also understood that this mission would represent the ultimate test of whether she could balance personal relationships with professional responsibilities, whether she could use her lethal skills to protect people she cared about without losing the objectivity that had made her successful. As Lisa began planning the rescue operation that would bring her full circle from the gang confrontation in Oregon to the human trafficking networks along the Mexican border, she realized that her journey of transformation was entering its final phase. She'd learned to integrate her deadly capabilities with her humanity, to choose her battles while maintaining her connections, and to use her skills in service of justice rather than institutional convenience. The woman who'd been called lucky shot at a shooting competition in Montana, who'd tried to disappear as a small-town accountant, and who'd emerged as an independent contractor, was about to discover whether the life she'd built could survive. The ultimate test of personal and professional integration. Lisa Rodriguez was ready for whatever came next, confident in her abilities and committed to her principles. The war for her survival had evolved into a mission to protect others, and she intended to win both battles. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.